Betty. Good girl. Come on. Look at you. Look at you. Yeah. Hello. Hello. Today I'm going to show you how I painted a giant portrait of my pet dog, and I'll talk you through the 4 steps of painting that I've been through while showing you them like this in full. So before I started, I have drawn a faint pencil outline which you can just about see on the camera. That's with watercolor pencil. Within that, I'm painting my first layer, and this is really step 1 of the painting. Soft, wet on wet watercolors, where you pay attention to the strongest values and just allow a gentle wash of color to fill up those areas. I'm not trying to get the darkest darks. I'm not trying to get anything except a reminder to myself of the layering process, which will build up our values. And this is layer 1. The colours I've used specifically for my dog, Payne's Grade, a little bit of quinacridone sienna. You can see it's all dried off now, and it's much fainter, and that's fine because we are doing a layering process. Step 2 is not actually to paint Betty herself at all, Betty of course being my dog, but to do the background. And what I'm doing, I'm taking suggestions from the background. We've got these greens, we've got purple flowers, we've got moody, murky browns, and I'm just making that into something a little bit abstract, a sort of classic watercolor splash of a background. It's important to get this in early as, for me, step 2, because this will enable me to work out the relative contrast. Because something dark or something light on the page only looks dark or light next to something else. If the background has a bit of value, if the background has a bit of colour, it makes pulling apart the little details within the portrait so much easier. And now we're back with that all dry. Time to clean out the old palette and start working on the midtones. So here, Betty is a fantastic model because she's mostly kind of a nice Payne's grey colour, or even closer to black than that. But she also has some little highlights in there. But I'm mostly just focusing now on applying darker colours, not the darkest colours, but darker colours. And I'm still just keeping things soft. So you can see I'll paint an area with my one brush. This is a size 24 round brush. And then I'll come in with another brush. Mostly I'm using this quill brush. And that quill brush is clean. And all I'm doing with that is applying water to the edges of the colour to keep them soft. We don't need to draw any fur yet. We don't need to paint any fur yet. This is all about just suggesting gradually the little details. Having done that kind of side of her head, I'm going to focus in on the eye. Again, just getting those middle values, certainly not working into the darkest darks yet, and certainly not working into the biggest details. With things drying, I move down to a slightly smaller brush, and I just want more variety in that wash. So I'm dropped in a few bits of darker pigment to allow it to just soften out. And everything, I must stress, is really softly painted at the moment. That means painting wet on wet, not with dry edges. What we do now is repeat the process on the right hand side. I started this time with her eye. It doesn't feel quite right at the moment yet, so I sort of went, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I started repeating my normal process, the soft watercolors first, and we can come back and correct things a bit later. Watercolors are permanent when you've put them down, pretty much permanent, but you can still come in and layer on top with darker colors to correct things which didn't feel quite right. And hopefully here you're recognizing the kind of processes, coming in with some darker pigment and then applying a little bit of water, some lighter pigment to soften up the edges. And here, again, coming back into that eye and just getting it to feel a little bit more correct, a little bit more in proportion with the other eye. Now on a smaller painting, what I would probably do is I do each layer individually across the whole painting. But because this is such a huge piece of paper, I'm having to adapt my processes so that I can continue to paint wet on wet. And then I come back and do darker details like this in her right eye when the page is dry, but also purposefully wetting the page to allow it to soften out a bit. So I don't want it to be a really hard, bold line yet. We're still not in our next stage where we start thinking about the darkest values and specific details and textures. Instead, just moving around gradually, bringing out different aspects, different areas and elements. So you can hopefully see now moved on to the snout. So we did the right side of a face, the left side of a face. Now we'll do the sort of snout and the neck area. Paying attention where there are specific details which are a bit scary, like the nose and the eyes kind of have to feel a bit right. And being a bit looser where the details are less important. Doing lots of softening work. And even sort of dry brushing to get some of those lightest values in, where it's not pure white, it's actually a little bit grey. Just getting those kind of dry brush textures in. And using water all the time, lots of water, to allow things to feel soft and a little bit, hopefully a little bit dramatic and fun. And now, continue the process, moving down her body. This is getting towards being sort of away from the focal point. So I can make much bigger marks, much faster progress. Just really splashing on that paint and being a bit more abstract, a bit looser, a bit more textured as well. Because I'm not going to come back with as much detail later on when we get to adding in those darkest details and some of those fur textures. Because I don't want detail everywhere. I want detail to draw the eye to her face. And everywhere else I want it to be a little bit soft and gentle. You can also see I've sort of moved to a flat brush here. That was just me experimenting with different textures and how it felt. I also splash in some water. You can see nice little cauliflowers emerging in her fur in places. And seamlessly I sort of move into the next stage, which is using a much smaller brush to apply those first textures. So it's tempting when you look at a reference to go, white and black, but actually there's very little true white in this reference. There are elements of white, but most of her white fur is actually slightly grey, slightly yellowed, slightly brown, in shadow. So now what I want to do is bring out some of those textures, and that's where this little brush, this is actually a size 4 round brush, comes in, and just lots and lots and lots of repetitive movements. One thing to remember with fur is that fur and all the sort of textures which come with it tend to move in the direction of the sort of volume of the object. So wherever the volume of the object is, her neck's a cylinder, the lines tend to go outwards in line with that cylinder. Lots of little dots on her face as well, which all build up that texture, just gently, layer by layer, bringing out all these little bits and bobs. And hopefully now you start to see some kind of sense of 3D emerging. It's actually almost at a point where you could probably leave it and call it done. And in many ways, this kind of really loose point, this loose feel, can be really magic in watercolors. And trying to chase something better than this, as it were, can be difficult. I just wanted a bit more depth to start with. So again, I got this flat brush out just to bring out some of those darkest areas. And all the time, I'm just using those same couple of colours, bit of quinacridone, sienna, a bit of Payne's grey, and just using them, layering up to get more and more depth, and gradually leaving more and more areas without those further layers. Down for her collar, lovely bright red collar. I actually was a little bit disappointed with how I did this. It took me a bit of fiddling and faffing to get it to feel like it was part of the same image. It just was a bit like cartoony and a bit not well thought out when I first put that red down. A bit too straight, a bit too strict with the lines. And that's why I started bringing out the pencils now. Actually, firstly, because I wanted to just control that collar a little bit more, give it a bit more something about it. But then, because I got them out, I started using them to generate some more of those fur marks. It's just, I like doing it. I think it adds a different texture, adds a kind of opaque texture, which you can't easily get with watercolors without making them really thick. It's easier to control. You just sharpen the pencil, you have a really fine point. And you can see, even though I'm making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of marks, they build up very subtly. So it gives you loads of time to think about what you're doing. If you want a more immediate and really quick result, then stick with the watercolors. Or if you want absolute total control, then the watercolors are also great. But I really enjoyed using these finer little touches with the pencils. And also just, you can soften them out. They're watercolor pencils, so even though they leave lots of sort of hard edges, you can come back in, soften them out with a bit of water. and that provides background value. It makes the textures more interesting. Here, moving again toward more and more detail, this time with the amount of darkness I wanted in her mouth, which to me feels like one of the strongest values. I started with a bit of watercolour with a really fine brush, and then come back in with some pencil and start moving little bits around again, adding more detail, adding more texture, and then again flipping between that and using water to soften things out, move things around a little bit, and just make it feel more of a connected kind of painting. I then build a bit of confidence to come back into this collar, which I think eventually got there. It's still not quite what I would hope, but I'd almost forgotten about it. So that shows it doesn't draw the eye too much. Even though I, as the person who did it, knows that I don't like it, I had forgotten about it. And that's the thing we've got to do as artists, is remember that other people viewing the painting don't necessarily have the same focus as us. Even if they are not that impressed by the collar, when they actually look at the painting, they probably don't notice it at all, because they just weren't aware that you didn't like it and it wasn't exactly what you wanted to come out of your painting process. Now, getting towards the end is the time that I would like to start adding in some highlights. So I've got a couple of light coloured pencils. This is actually a white pencil. I can use that to re-add white onto the page. This is, of course, the lazy way to do it with watercolours. The real way, the proper way, is to leave white paper or even use masking fluid and things. That's where you can do it with absolute control if you are a true sort of classic painter. But for us sketchers, us mere mortals, having extra tools to add white onto the page is actually quite fun. It makes life a lot easier, and it adds a different texture, it adds something different and actually a bit more, in many ways, modern. That mixed media feel does tend to be a bit more contemporary in how it looks, and that's also why I'm coming in with some of these sort of light greys and a little bit of blue. Now, last but not least, of course, the background I haven't touched since the very beginning, and just to give it a little bit of something extra, added a few splashes into the background, and then it's done. I just need to let it dry, and I'm going to pop this one in a frame as a present. So need to measure it up and buy a very expensive frame because it's a really big painting. A bit different from my channel than normal today, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.